This is the Nobel Podcast, where we talk about how to optimize your technology, life, and mind. We're joined by special operations veterans, entrepreneurs, investors, and others who have overcome difficulty to make it to the top of their craft by staying in the fight. Welcome to the Nobel Podcast. My name is Sam Alaimo. I'm joined by Bob Graham, former United States Air Force pilot with 4 tours in the Vietnam War, 500 plus combat flights, and out with a new book about his time in the service called One of the Few. Bob, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's start where we always do. Where did you grow up?
So I was raised in Bloomfield, New Jersey. And then when I finished high school, I went off to college and I had full scholarships, athletic scholarships, so I had a letter in 2 sports and then an academic scholarship for the other half. So at the end of my freshman year, my father was in the process of dying and my mother had terminal cancer. And I was an only child and there was no close relatives. I didn't have to worry about paying for college because that was paid for. I just needed to figure out how to eat.
Right.
And who was going to pay the rent? And no answers just jumped right out at me. So I happened to be in Air Force ROTC in the first year. So I went up to the ROTC commander up there, who happened to be, of course, the Air Force colonel. And I said, what should I do? And he said, enlist in the Air Force. And he probably said that to everybody. But anyway, so I did. I quit college and I went off. I enlisted in the Air Force, went off to basic training, did the things where everybody goes off to basic training and got through that. I happened to be on the base boxing team, and my first sergeant was the middleweight champ of the Air Force.
Nice.
And so he took a liking to me. And after a couple of months, he said to me, kid, you're wasting your time. Go off to flight school. And the Air Force at the time had an arrangement called aviation cadets. You had the equivalent of 2 years of college. You could apply for aviation cadets and take tests and go through them. And I didn't know the front end of an airplane from the back end of an airplane. I don't think I'd ever seen one. And but he told me in some fairly direct terms that to just go sign up and go there. So I went off to flight school, flew in the back seat of the first all-weather fighter interceptors that we had, because remember, let's say 1956-ish, we were still converting from prop-driven fighters to jet fighters. So my experience was with the very first jet fighters. And I was in the back seat as a weapons system officer. So as a sideline, I assumed that once my my obligations to the Air Force were over, I'd probably go back to college on the GI Bill. And so I applied for Penn and got accepted. And so one day, in order to get our fighters renovated, if you will, and updated and stuff like that, we had a major depot out in California, just north of LA. And so we used to fly the fighters out there and pick up a new one, rebuilt one and fly that back. So I was in the backseat of one of those trips, and we went out there, picked up our renovated fighter and left out of LA, and we're going to make the first stop in Las Vegas at Nellis Air Force Base. Coincidentally, the engine failed as we're coming towards Nellis, and we had a dead stick airplane into Nellis, and so we were there for like about 36 hours maybe or something like that while they were repairing the engine. And the pilot that I had flown in the Korean War. And so he knew some of the guys on the Thunderbirds and also some of the guys teaching at the Top Gun school and stuff like that. So we sat around for a couple of evenings drinking beer with those guys, and I decided that when I grew up, what I really wanted to do is not go off to college and become a businessman, but instead I wanted to go fly fighters. So I'd already been accepted to flight school. I went back and I canceled my seat in Penn and waited for a pilot training seat. Then went through pilot training rather.
What year was this?
59 or 60.
So well before anybody knew what was going to happen in Vietnam.
Yeah, right. But one of the things I was sure of is I wanted to go fly the F-100 because that was the cool thing. First airplane ever go supersonic and level flight, and is the greatest fighter in the whole world. And so that's what all the guys at Nellis told me to do when I got back. So anyway, that course course of training was about a year in flight school, and then about just under another year in advanced gunnery training. So I had 2 years. And then, so I showed up in Japan about, which was my first operational assignment in 61-ish. And that got me to the beginning of my time in Asia. And yeah, sort of the beginning of my operational fighter career.
So I had to cherry pick parts of the books because there is so much there that I'm going to focus and bounce around a little bit. But you were stationed at one point near the DMZ in Korea and had basically a nuclear mission. And you had one incident where you were talking about hot nosing.
Oh,
And this is an example of, in the military is a very professional reputation. But one of the ways you get better at your job is by bending the rules a lot of times.
yeah, well,
I never heard of hot nosing, and this is a really good example. You want to talk about what happened near the DMZ?
okay. So while we were sitting nuclear alert, typically we sit it for a week at a time. And during that week, you usually got one day off where you could go fly. And whenever you went to fly, we had a gunnery range up the west coast of Korea just a little bit. And we jump in the jet and go up there. And then maybe a half hour, 45 minutes on the range. And then usually we had a little time left over. And the range was only about maybe 60, 75 miles south of the DMZ. And so the two of us were up there and we're running around, doing some acrobatics and stuff like that, killing time. And we saw what we thought was a South Korean F-86 up there kind of wandering around. And so we thought we hot nose them. Now, the hot nose means that you take the obviously the target doesn't know you're there, and it's probably not going to find out until the last moment. And what you do is you take your two aircraft in close formation, run it up to just under Mach 1 speed of sound, and come underneath them low at 6 o'clock. And then just as you pull up immediately in front of his nose, you stroke the burners. And since he didn't know you were there, that comes as a surprise, a complete surprise.
How many feet roughly away are you when you do this?
Pretty close, because everybody's traveling about. Well, we were traveling about Mach 1, and he's traveling probably 400 or 500 miles an hour. So as you go through, you're not there very long in front of his nose, so I would guess 10 yards maybe.
At
Like
400 or 500 miles per hour. Does it?
Well, we were probably closer to 600.
So what happens to the person in that plane? Do they feel just a massive shudder?
Yeah. So the guy in that airplane is in shock because all of a sudden he thinks he's just cruising around. And nobody's there. He's all by himself. And the next thing he knows, two guys with their afterburners on past, tight to his nose. And that has a fairly dramatic effect, as you might expect on the guy. So as we're pulling up, we go up, roll over on our back, and we're looking down at the guy because as we passed, we realized that he wasn't a South Korean F-86. Turns out he was a North Korean MiG.
Oops. Yeah.
It had wandered south of the DMZ. So as we went by, you could see his airplane was almost out of control completely, and he's wandering all over. And the next thing you know, he starts heading north about as fast as the airplane would go. We, on the other hand, obviously that's against the rules. You're not supposed to do that to people. So as we're coming back, it was one of those things you land, you're walking in from the ramp, and you say, we probably ought not to mention that. But it was great fun. Yeah, that was good. That was fun.
The nuclear mission itself is interesting. You said something when you would train to drop the bomb, if you had to drop a nuclear bomb, it would be in such a way where you would not have enough fuel to come back.
Right.
Was that essentially a suicide mission, or was it built into the plan you would have to eject and just make your way back?
Right. So, so typically when we sat alert, each of us had a single target. And so you have an airplane and a nuke bomb strapped underneath the belly of the airplane. The idea behind it is that and obviously we're working Russia and China. The idea is that if you're going to have a nuclear war, the bomb is going to take a while to get there. And what we wanted to do is blow a hole in the fence so that the bombers behind us could penetrate deeper and deeper without, uh, any heavy defenses going in until they got much further in. So for us, when you got over there on a Saturday afternoon, you studied up for a target, and in my case, it was almost always a target in China. And you only had enough fuel to get there. So essentially, it was a low-level, high-speed ingress into China, pop up, do like a, for lack of a better word, an Immelman. The bomb releases, and you had enough gas to get just outside of the large explosion, for lack of a better description. And after that, you flame out and punch out. And of course, as I joke about, the idea is that you could jump out, land in the middle of the natives, and make friends, and spend the rest of the whatever length of time you had for the nuclear war. You could spend with them and your friends and stuff like that, and maybe find a second career or whatever. But yeah, all the rides were one-way rides, and that psychologically takes a little getting used to. You got to think your way through that. So,
Did pilots talk about what that meant? They knew it was, you basically weren't going to come back from that. If you just dropped a
right.
nuke in China and then you ejected over China, you're not coming home.
No,
So did everybody just accept that?
yeah, you kind of had to, because somebody was going to have to do it. You were selected, and
Wow.
it was part of what you signed up to do. The idea of living or dying when you're in that kind of a business, you have to accept the fact that your chances of dying are very high. And don't forget, in a fighter squadron back then, in the five squadrons I was in, your fatality rate is about 20% a year. So it's not as if dying is not something that you've already accepted. And in fact, part of that is the fact that, we were taught to and pressed to get as far out on the feather edge as you possibly could. The idea of beating the other guy who theoretically is the best that they have, you have to be able to drive yourself out on the edge further than he can drive himself out on the edge, right? And if you think about it from the standpoint of what the basketball coaches teach you, they always talk about you need that extra half a step. Well, one way you get that extra half a step is you accept the fact that you are going to die. And most other people won't accept that. Intuitively, they'll push back against that, right? And when they do, they'll hesitate and you won't. And so you got that half step. And that's usually a big deal because that oftentimes is what gets you to survive and them to lose. So part of that is training yourself to accept the fact that you're not going to live through this one. So deal with it.
It seems to have served you well in the rest of your career. So right around this time, the Vietnam War didn't kick off, but we started sending Americans there in advisory capacities.
Yeah.
Unofficially for deniability. And it was typically military who were basically decommissioned from the military and sent there as civilians. And you ended up boots on the ground, not even as a pilot in Vietnam in 1962, I believe.
Yeah.
And had some pretty intense combat fighting alongside the Vietnamese. You want to just take it from there and how did that come about and talk about your first exposure?
My first trip into combat, I'd only been there for a week or 10 days.
Within a week, you were in a firefight.
Yeah. Well, when I became a civilian, went through the Tokyo, or the embassy of Tokyo, got discharged from the Air Force, went next door and went to work for, and I'm not sure about the name, but the name was something like the American Botanical Survey Corporation. It was something like that. I'd been through all the necessary survival schools and, training schools and stuff like that in the Air Force before that. But I left Tokyo, flew down to Philippine Island to Manila, had maybe a 3-day introduction in Manila, went across to Saigon, got 3 or 4 days in Saigon, and then ran up to my first assignment was with 25th ARVN, the Vietnamese Army division.
So to be clarified, you were, for all intents and purposes, a civilian right now,
Right.
working for an NGO, a non-governmental organization,
Right.
which is a cover organization.
Right.
Said you're essentially conducting the military operations in Vietnam,
Yeah, I was advising.
advising with complete separation. So if you were caught or captured,
You're a civilian.
you're screwed.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Because you have no identification, you have no rank, you have no, anything. You're literally, working as an advisor. Well, the problem with the whole advisor description is that you're probably going to end up advising from the front as opposed to the rear.
That's right.
It's not like, inviting a guy into your office, because first of all, you don't have an office, but you did have 10, but you're not going to be able to train the Vietnamese. So I was assigned to the 25th Armored Division. And at that point in time, you become a forward air controller, but you're not flying at the time. So you're on the ground. And I happened to be, they had like a portion of that division battalion or something was a Ranger battalion. And so they used those or the Rangers for smaller contacts.
These are Vietnamese Rangers, not American Rangers.
No, they were Vietnamese Rangers. So I was assigned to them, spent probably 2 days maybe. We got some intel that there was a pretty good sized VC group that was in this particular location in the jungle. So there was a American Marine helicopter outfit down in Saigon that was supporting almost everybody in the country. So they sent up probably the entire squadron of Marine helicopters. And we were going to set up an arrangement where we were going to have a three-piece driving force to drive Viet Cong into, I think they used to call it hammer and anvil type of operation, where you drive into a Ranger blocking force. So I was going to go in with the first wave in the choppers. So it's kind of a funny story afterwards. It wasn't so funny at the time, but anyway, so the night before going in, a Marine commander of the chopper outfit says, he briefing us on, he says, okay, now we're expecting, or we should expect a 10% loss rate going into the LZ. And that's the first time it ever occurred to me that we're going to lose 10% of the guys before we got to the fight. So that was sort of an eye-opener. And of course, the adrenaline's flowing, and I'm all excited, and this is going to be my first show. So then and I obviously never been on a chopper going into an LZ. So the Marine sergeant takes me aside, because I'm the only American, takes me aside, and he said, now listen, the way the thing works is we can't be on the ground very long because, people shooting at you and get out of here. I said, so you're going to be the first one off the chopper. When I tap you on the back, out you go. Okay, I got it. So I'm going in, and of course, I was so nervous and so anxious that if he had sneezed and tapped on the shoulder, I'd have jumped out at 500 feet. Anyway, so in we go to the elephant grass, and we're going to land on the elephant grass, and then we're going to go to this, to the jungle, which is just about not very far, maybe 75 yards or so away. And so chopper lands, guy hits me on the shoulder. I go out, and at John Wayne time, and I'm running through the elephant grass, and people are, shooting and carrying on. And I got about 10 or 15 yards, and I thought, geez, I'm the only guy that got off the chopper. So the next thought was, they're going to take the chopper and they're going to leave, and I'm going to be here all by myself. And that's not going to be a very good thing. So anyway, so I turn around, I start running back to the chopper. At this time, the Marine sergeant, I've got things under control, and now all the Rangers coming off the chopper. So they go by me. I turn around, and now I'm the last guy in the line heading for the jungle tree line. So
it seems like they didn't want to get off because they didn't want to fight, correct?
Right.
That's a sign of things to come.
And also because they were smarter than I was. They'd probably done that before, and I never had. So.
That was your first firefight. Did you spend the night on that firefight?
We were there for a couple of days. It was one of those things where we never made hard contact. We had some brush contacts and stuff like that, but there's no hard. And I felt that the Vietnamese were doing it in slow motion, so that by the time they began to drive the Viet Cong force into where the anvil was. The Viet Cong had dissipated and gone off through the side, and so by the time you get to the anvil, it's not a lot there. So the lesson that I took away from that is that, one, when you're working on the ground, you want to make sure that everybody gets off the chopper at the same time. And the other thing was that you don't want to have too much confidence in your Vietnamese cohorts, because they may not be there, when the loud noises start. But anyway, so that was my first introduction in, how to be a novice infantry officer.
You had an early taste. Did you, as an advisor in 1962?
Yeah.
What did you think about our involvement there? Did you realize it was going to be this full hardcore war in a short period of time? Did you think it was necessary? What did you think as the advisor?
So before I went down there, I had flown down. I flew down to Taiwan. Taiwan was the knockoff book capital of Asia at the time, and I got all of the books, all the French books that had been written about Southeast Asia, and I took them back up and I studied them very, very carefully. And my going in proposition was that it was a really good idea to go to war, but the important aspect of it was I thought Kennedy was right. That was a special ops war. And later on, as I went back over and over again, the problem, I think the basic problem that never went away, was the American military decided to turn it into a variation of World War II. And it never should have happened. That it really was a special ops war. Had we continued to fight it that way, our chances of success would have been, I think, remarkably better. But more importantly, if things weren't going well, if things were starting to go sideways, if you have a special ops war, you can pull everybody out in a heartbeat, turn around and say, not us, we were never there. And we didn't do that. Instead, we took, by the time we were finished, with 500,000 Americans in there fighting the war. I thought that was right next up borderline stupid. I mean, we certainly never should have committed that soon, that way, to trying to fight some sort of a fixed peace European attritional war. That's what we did, and it worked out very, very poorly.
It almost sounds like the advisors were sent there to get some sort of assessment, and then their recommendations were completely jettisoned in favor of a straight up conventional war.
Yeah, later on, I ended up flying with a Vietnamese squadron for quite a while. I mean, maybe 75 missions or so. And I got fired. And actually, I was told that I was being thrown out of the country persona non grata. And I was kind of temporarily out of work. I was sort of unemployed at that time. And so I was able to help out, and they assigned me to one of our A-teams, the Special Forces A-teams from the Army.
Was this the incident where you were flying with a well-connected Vietnamese officer?
Yeah.
You want to talk about that real quick?
Right. So we had a problem at the time in that particular mission, and so I had I think in a very short period of time, like a few seconds, I had criticized not only him, but him, all of his family, anybody that had shaken hands with, everybody he knew, and even his dog. And I didn't think I overlooked anybody. Well, it turns out I did not, because he was a nephew of the president. And so when that happens, why, I got fired, and they said, we're going to throw you out of the country. And so I went down to my boss and the agency guy, and I said, I'm looking for a job, and what do you got going? So anyway, so to speed things up, moved through that, and
So this was your second tour, right?
this is my first tour.
Okay.
Still on my first tour. So on my first tour, I went first with the Vietnamese Rangers. Then they decided that they needed advisors with the Vietnamese Air Force, and so I volunteered to fly with those guys for a while.
Got it.
Then I got fired, and then they assigned me to an American A-team for a while.
So when you were flying with the Vietnamese, that's when you were doing the mission where you were lobbing grenades out of the window.
Right. Yeah.
That was just some savage, primitive version of close air support?
I was maybe the first or second forward air controller that we had checked out with the Vietnamese Air Force. So when you go out there, first of all, the airplane, the spotter airplane's canvas, right?
A
So
propeller canvas.
yeah, propeller canvas airplane, and top speed's like 120 miles an hour.
Ooh, it's an easy target.
The good news is you can't go very fast, but you can go very, very low and slow. And the bad news is when you're going low and slow, people shoot at you because when you're over the top of the target, everybody down there theoretically is a bad guy. And the way you tell the good guys from the bad guys is the bad guys shoot at you, and the good guys don't shoot at you. And so after maybe the second ride, you get to the idea. It says, so wait a minute, I'm low and slow, and I'm going to fly over the top of these guys, and they're going to shoot at me, and then, I'm going to have to mark a target with smoke grenade. And it didn't seem fair. And so we came up with the idea of, well, what if I shoot back? And I thought that was a really good idea. And then we thought, well, okay, in addition to smoke grenades, if we can shoot back, maybe we should drop hand grenades. Mm-hmm. And so the next thing you know, over a period of a couple of rides, we were kind of like World War I, right? So you're flying over the top of these guys, and they're shooting at you, and in that airplane, the windows open up and connect up. So all you do is kind of fly and guide it with your knees while you're shooting out the window. And then we decided, when I say we had 5 Americans involved in this operation. And we lived in a tent in Da Nang, or back then that was Da Nang. And we had an officers club, and the officers club was a concrete slab, maybe a quarter the size of this room. And there was a bamboo thatch roof hut and stuff like that. And we could get booze sent up from Saigon in a shovel transport. And I don't know how they got it, that there was an old ice maker that maybe got left there by the French or something like that. So we had ice, and we had water in blister bags and American booze imported from Saigon. So at night, whoever was there that evening, of the 5 of us, on Saturday night, we would have sitting around, having a drink, because the next day in Vietnam back then, they didn't fight the war on Sundays.
Both good and bad guys took Sunday off.
Yeah. Wow. No war on Sundays. But the Vietnamese said, well, you guys are Americans, so, you're not, you don't have to worry about that. But if you want to fly our airplanes, well, you can. So, which was a good idea. So we'd sit around, a few of us would sit around and say, well, okay, what targets did you go on this week that you thought maybe we ought to go back and visit on Sunday? And so we came up with all kinds of things. I think the first thing we decided that we needed more air power. And so we started out and said, we'll go to the chow hall and we'll use the peanut butter jars. And we'll open up the peanut butter jar and we'll pull the pin on the hand grenade, stick the hand grenade in, and screw the top back on. And the idea being that now we have a bombing capability, and we can fly over the top of the bad guys, and we can shoot the bad guys, and we can drop hand grenades on the bad guys. And that led us from there to, we thought that we could do the same thing, not the same thing, but kind of like the same thing with a satchel charge. And so we tied a string around the pin or the fuse or whatever it was, and we throw the satchel charge out. And we tried that one Sunday. But the problem was that we did it wrong, and the pin never came out. So we had the satchel charge hanging under the airplane as we were flying it. We had to haul the thing back in. But each Saturday night, we come up with different ways to enhance air power, and also where we're going to go the next afternoon after we sobered up to go out and find a target that we thought was interesting from last week.
How did the peanut butter grenade work? So when it landed, they would open? Okay, it didn't work.
The problem is the ground's soft.
Okay.
Right? And we're not going to be dropping it. We're only going to be dropping it from like 25, 30 feet. And so we went through the process of saying we the peanut butter jars aren't the right jar, that we need thinner jars. And the thinner jars were sometimes good, sometimes bad. But the big deal was if we could hit something hard, then it worked out fine.
Yeah.
But otherwise, you have a live grenade in a peanut butter jar that the Viet Cong can have. And we made the assumption and said, if you guys really want the hand grenade inside the peanut butter jar, all you got to do is unscrew the top and then very carefully get the hand grenade back up, but hang on to it. Because, obviously somebody's got to be hanging on to it.
Yeah.
So you could kind of pass it around. Yeah. So anyway, so we would do that. And, but the problem was that when we were on duty with the Vietnamese, the Americans could not become the aircraft commander because we were only advisors. So we needed to have a little Vietnamese lieutenant. He wasn't a pilot or anything like that. He was just some guy.
Along for the ride.
And he's in the back seat. And the job of the guy in the back seat was theoretically, I'm in the front and I'm flying the airplane, and the guy in the back is going to drop the smoke grenade. And that's his only job. All he's got to do is pull the pin out of the smoke grenade, throw it out the window, and everything else it takes care of. But this particular guy that we're talking about was afraid of heights. And in order to do anything, he needed to be closer to the window. But when he got closer to the window, he was really, scared to death. And so he would lean back on the other side of the seat, pull the pin, and then throw it out the window. And so one day he missed the window. And that was the day when now we have a smoke grenade rolling around on the seat, and we don't have a lot of time for him to pick up, find it, and throw it out the window again. So finally he did. But during that interval was when I insulted him and all of his relatives and anybody he had ever met and things like that. And that's when I got fired. So
you got fired for in a really dramatic way. If you're going to get fired, that's the way to do it.
yeah,
And then to basically save your career and cool off,
right,
you went to probably the most dangerous mission possible, which was to join the Special Forces, who had their A camps dotted throughout Vietnam.
right,
And they were super small units involved in guerrilla warfare.
yeah,
And they partnered with the Montagnards, who I've read a lot about, the tribesmen of Vietnam.
yeah,
And that mission, I mean, that's the infamous mission. Like that's the famous, some of the most famous work done in Vietnam was with these guys. And then yourself, an Air Force pilot, ended up boots on the ground with Special Forces and the Montagnards.
right.
Pick it up there at the camp.
So I really like working with the Special Forces guys. I mean, that was really neat. And of course, I'm like a hod carrier's helper, right? But the one good thing that I learned after I became an officer was that senior NCOs make an assumption that young officers are not very bright and that they have to take care of them. And it's almost like a paternal feeling, right? So I get attached to this team, and a Special Forces team, I guess now and even then, at least a small ones. The A teams were like 12 guys.
Mm-hmm.
And we had 2 officers. And a funny aside, so when I reported in to the officer, he was a captain, and I thought, I'm going to meet some guy like Daniel Boone, right? That's really comfortable in the jungle, can, raised in the jungle probably and all that. And so when I first met him and introduced myself, and he said, what's your data rank and all? And we were talking, and I said, well, I'm from Bloomfield, New Jersey. And I said, I'm sure you were, like raised on the farm or something like that, because this comes natural to you. And he said, no, I come from the Bronx.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, we are seriously screwed. We got some guy from New Jersey and this guy's from the Bronx. And I said, we're never going to make it. But anyway, so I got a fast, constant course from the senior NCOs, and they taught me, how to survive. But being with guys like that, the level of professionalism is so high that it's just a pleasure to be around. I thought, they were remarkably effective. And that's part of where I came from, where I said, we fought the wrong war. We executed it poorly. In an area, which was a huge area, but that team was very, very effective in reducing the Viet Cong influence in that general area, to suppressing most of it, to interdicting the Ho Chi Minh Trail as they were moving supplies and people down in a very, very short period of time. They organized a Mountain Yard Village. They had a fairly significant team of Mountain Yard strikers. But every place you looked, they really had it put together well. So when I was asked periodically to go down to the embassy and brief the air attaché and then military attaché down there, both of those guys were 2-star generals. One out of the Air Force, who was a bomber pilot in World War II, and one tank guy out of World War II. And no question about the fact that They were successful in World War II. The problem is that insurgency warfare is not World War II in Central Europe. And they could not pivot, if you will. They could not get it out of their heads that you can't fight a jungle war anywhere in the world with the same tactics and strategy that you had in World War II, or even to a lesser extent, Korea. And as a result, it's through your embassy and your attaché that most of the information is moving back to Washington. And when bomber generals don't get along with fighter pilots and tank generals don't get along with special ops guys. And as a result of that, the special ops guys are never given credit for what they've achieved because the regular army guys were, at least back then, were, distrustful of what the special ops guys were doing.
Did they ever kind of tie their hands behind their backs and prevent them from doing their mission as special forces would?
I can't tell that because I don't know what was coming in, on the Army side of things. The agency at the time had complete operational control over the Army teams. And the problem there was that increased the distrust between the regular Army infantry guys, or in this case, tanker, and the special ops guys. Because the regular Army guys and the regular Air Force guys wanted to have command and access over their Army special ops, and the CIA guys were in the way. But I assume the president and his staff had decided that for the kind of war that they wanted to fight, that the agency would have full operational control over those guys, and obviously me. So, but that, if you will, internal distrust and the fact that the regular Army wanted a piece of the war. Mm-hmm. They eventually got a huge piece of the war, and in my view, screwed it up. And so it's an interesting thing. I thought a better way to do it would have been not to scale up and accelerate the American presence in the war until we were a little bit more savvy about how to fight those kinds of wars. See, back then, it probably wasn't until 59 or 60, or maybe slightly before the United States really got to thinking about insurgency, counterinsurgency warfare. Before that, it was about, because all their victories had come from World War II. And so the idea is that the way you fight a war is the same way we won in World War II. Now, so when you're dealing with, the agency and the special operations guys and their teams, covert operation teams, you're dealing with an entirely different strategy, an entirely different mindset. It's really hard for regular Army guys or regular Air Force guys to comprehend that. It's just, counterintuitive or something.
It's an entirely different mission set.
Yeah.
And like getting down, and it from boots on the ground. And you wrote about one of the A camps you were at that was being attacked. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. I agree with everything you're saying. The conventional forces were fighting in a way that the enemy was not, and it was a mismatch. Mm-hmm. How do we match them, boots on the ground, small units against small units, and ferret them out? The studies and observation groups did that extremely well. Mm-hmm. Special forces did it well when they could.
Yeah, they did.
Do you want to talk about?
SOG was a terrific. So was Phoenix, by the way.
Yeah.
And I don't know who it was. Carter. Maybe it was Carter that got all in a hissy fit about the Phoenix operation, but they were enormously successful.
Yeah.
And to put a stop to it, and then on top of that, fire all the people who are involved in it. It just took all your best special forces people, and you had them go hide in the closet.
Yeah, with a lot of experience. So you saw that night. Let's zoom into one night when your base was under attack, because it sounds like a sort of scene you would see from Apocalypse Now. It was a very different war from the one I'm familiar with.
Okay.
So like the jungle warfare is interesting to me. And you were talking about a night when your camp was being attacked, you were fighting beneath the flares, and a couple of guys made it through and were on their way to you. And it sounds like you were in a foxhole. Can I pick up that story?
Yeah. So a typical, I shouldn't say typical, but our 18 camp we were, if you will, not in the center of, but it's sort of attached to the mountain yard village. And we had a small compound,
How many Americans roughly?
12 special ops guys and me.
That is
13.
remarkably small.
And they used to work on the basis of 10-to-1 exchange rate. So the view is that if let's suppose we have 12 really effective guys, and so you say, well, if you want to take our compound, it'll cost you 120 guys. Well, that's a big size Viet Cong group because guerrilla groups in the jungle are usually smaller than that.
Are you saying for every one American you want 10 Montyards?
10 Viet Cong.
So you're saying one American can fight 10 Viet Cong basically?
Yeah.
So this camp can handle 120 Viet Cong attack.
120 Viet Cong. Theoretically, if the exchange rate's 10-to-1, and if you guys want to expend 120 guys, come, and oh, by the way, the bad news is that after you spend 120 guys, we'll give a phone call to the guys in the Mike Force, and we'll show up in about 10 days with another 12 guys, or maybe 30 guys out of the Mike Force. So, we can do this a lot longer, and you can do that, right? So when they hit us, I always had the feeling that they were trying to look when you had maybe a couple of guys out or whatever,
right,
where they could take advantage of that 10-to-1 relationship. But the general theory that we operate under was, okay, if you're willing to spend the guys, well, then okay.
I've read about a few of those. One circumstance, they actually had tanks against one of these A camps and just completely overrode it.
Yeah.
That was not infrequent. So you were in a somewhat similar situation where you were in a pretty decent attack.
So you have this little compound where we had, typically bamboo, a couple of bamboo huts that we lived in. And then you had in the center, you have what looks like a World War II pillbox. But in the center, it slopes down in the center, and you have a grenade pit. And then you have firing pits or firing stations all around it. But for us, we all had kind of a foxhole assigned to us, with a couple of, I don't know what you call them, firing sticks up on either side. And then around that were, I'm going to say, 3 layers of concertina. And we had some claymores and mines and some flares and stuff like that. And to the best of my knowledge, they always hit us at night because I guess they felt that they had an advantage at night. And on this one particular time, I shouldn't say it that way because it wasn't a frequent thing, but it was kind of a rare thing. But this one particular night, they did it. And of course, when they're coming through the wire and the flares are going up and, claymores are going off and here comes the bad guys. And so they got through the wire and I'm in my little spot here. And here comes 3 guys. And the guy in the middle has a rifle with a bayonet on it. Mm. And the other 2 guys, I guess are there. So when he gets shot, they get the rifle. And so they're coming at me, and it's like there, and but it's okay because I had a Thompson at the time, and I carried a 38 and typical machete and stuff like that. And but we'd been at it for a little while, and I was out of ammo for the Thompson, but I was still.
How many magazines did you carry?
I think I had 2 or 3.
So you fired at 60 or 90 rounds?
Oh, couldn't have. But I was excited. So
just laying down the fire.
Yeah. So probably when they were way out there. But as these guys are coming in, I ran out of ammo for the Thompson. And so I grabbed my trusty 38 because I'd gone to the John Wayne movies. I knew I could handle this, right? So I shoot the 2 guys on either side. So far, so good. Except that ran me out of 38 ammo. So that wasn't so good. And the guy in the middle, I'd hit a couple of times, and he keeps coming. He's just a little guy with a big rifle and bayonet. So as he's coming towards me, I'm sitting there thinking, Jesus, I'm really in trouble. I just shot this guy twice and he's still coming. And so about the time, I stand up because I think this is going to be a knife fight. And so just as he gets in front of me, he dies in front of me. And I thought, I could have had a heart attack watching him do that. But anyway.
What was your mind process pulling machete? I've never been in that situation, thank God.
Well, so these guys were not firing the rifle. So he had a bayonet. So
Yeah.
I'm assuming.
It was a legitimate knife fight.
Right. So my 38 doesn't work very well. So one of the things I learned that night, by the way, when I'm excited, trying to reload a 38 revolver is not the thing I do best. So I immediately left the 38 business and got myself a Browning 9mm, which works just fine. And then I can carry a lot of clips. So anyway, but the joke of it all was that, I'm thinking, because it's not like I have a ton of experience. And here come these guys, and they've gone through the wire. They're still coming. And I'm thinking, wow, I'm in big trouble. So it wasn't that I was trying to have a knife fight with my machete. It's just, it looked like that was what was left.
Worst case scenario.
Yeah.
You were still technically a civilian at this point in time? Were you officially in the military?
No, I was a civilian.
So this is where it gets interesting. I've read quite a bit about Vietnam, and it doesn't typically work out well when you get captured. And you were tasked at one point on a search and rescue mission for an American who'd been captured.
Yeah.
And you talk about how you set the ambush, didn't end up getting them on the ambush, or he wasn't there when you ambushed them.
Right.
You kind of backtracked where they came from, and then you ended up finding where he was, and he had been tortured and killed.
Yeah.
That is as bad as it gets, and I think it probably reframes things for you. Not just the fact that you're executed, but that you're tortured. Can you talk about what it was, how you found him, and then how that shaped the rest of your time in the war?
Okay. So there were very, very few American advisors over there at the time. And so typically what would happen is it was a big coup. First of all, we all had bounties on our head. Right. So like it was quite a compliment, actually.
What were you worth? Do you know?
Yeah, because Radio Hanoi would say, "Hey, there's a whatever 1 year's pay reward for
It's pretty good.
Bob Graham."
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, they knew your name?
Yeah. They also.
So
say,
there's obviously a good leak there as well.
Yeah, which and very complimentary.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
That's awesome.
So anyway. But there weren't very many American advisors. So what they would try to do is, whenever, like when you were working with the mountain yards, some small percentage of the mountain yards would really be planted in there in order to steal a weapon and kill an American. And so that was pretty commonplace. And the fact that there was always, for them, always a lot of money on the table, then, Trump an American was a big deal. And, so anyway, the way it typically worked was if they could capture you injured and alive, they would put you in a tiger cage, which is a bamboo type cage. And then they would take you through the villages for a day or two. They're really not logistically set up to support a captive, but they would take him through the village in the tiger's cage and torture him and allow the villagers to torture him. And then at some point in time, 2, 3, 4 days, they would typically have some, I suppose, big ceremony of sorts where they would impale the captive on a stake in the center of the village. So the best thing that would have happened to them is they would have been tortured to death before they got to the stake.
Yeah.
But if you were living long enough to get to the stake, it was a tough way to die. So one of the things that was a takeaway for me was that I did not intend to be captured in any of my succeeding tours. But I also took it upon myself to think, well, I'm kind of handy in the woods, and I got to punch out and fend for myself. Well, I'll just fight from the ground instead of from the air.
So this kind of comes into what you wrote about in your book. You wrote about the combat mind. And you said you live at the survival level where everything is a function of living or dying. And a lot of people call that zone. A lot of people call that the flow. and you called your ability to get into that the switch. Can you talk about how you would get into that state and what it felt like to operate in that zone while you're actually in the field?
Yeah. So, and I really kind of, my first tour was kind of my introduction to the head game problem that we all face. And a problem I had an advantage because when I got back in the Air Force again, I got back in my own fighter squadron with all my buddies there, and and that was almost a perfect environment to get your head back screwed on right. But it was a very, very difficult transition for me, dealing with a wife and family and other people, as well. And that period of transition, coming back, was long enough to where, we're talking weeks and months, probably closer to months than weeks. And then you got to turn around and go back at it again. So in the business, you're going to have to switch on and switch off. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how to do that effectively. And I decided that I could switch on and off really well during the day. That, your conscious mind, if you're self-disciplined, your conscious mind will allow you to switch back and forth. So you can be, for all intents and purposes, the military variation of Jekyll and Hyde. And then, so the hard part is always coming back to your family and coming back to a more normalized environment. What I found is I can scale up really quickly to get back into combat.
What does that? This is something that happened a lot in the War on Terror, because you have guys who would do 15 combat deployments.
Right.
And some people would just get broken. At some point, you just can't take it anymore. How did you cognitively get yourself in that zone?
This is going to sound weird. So I happen to be really comfortable in that. So and I know.
I think most people are. The hard part is the transition from that zone to family mode.
Right.
But it sounds like you were able to just flick that switch and not struggle bouncing back and forth.
By the time I was back home 3 weeks or 4 weeks, I had the day game good. I would look like, for all intents and purposes, I was normal. I paid for all my sins at night, and then
Sleeping.
Yeah, or not sleeping. That's the case, very big. But the nights were really tough. But the days, I could get my arms around that fairly fast. But I found that I had to get back to my family gradually. I could get back to the squadron quick, but to go back to a family environment with the normal things that you have going on in the family, that was really hard. So I kind of took that in small bites until I could get that going. The reverse of that was that when I was going back in, if you gave me a few days or a week and a half or something like that, I was full up and I was comfortable and fit in well and got back in the flow, if you will, very, very quickly.
It's something I've seen a lot too. Is you enjoy that condition, that zone, that survival mentality, and then you notice when you got back, you said you were changed, you had short tempered, obviously had trouble at night sleeping,
right?
But at the same time, you wanted to get back.
Right.
It was a horrible experience. You're out of it in safety.
Yeah.
You want to get back to it.
Right.
There's something paradoxical about that is universal.
So think of it this time. Let's suppose you're on a football team and you just got smacked around by the guy opposite you. So the coach pulls you out and he puts you on a bench. And you go, I don't want to be on a bench. I owe that guy one.
Yeah.
Right? So if you go back through my tours, you find out that they're all about, hey, I didn't sign up to sit on the bench.
That's right.
I signed up to play, and I happen to be very, very good at it. And when you see a group like a squadron or something like that, and later when I commanded a squadron, for example, you got, let's suppose you have about 25 guys in a squadron. You got a half a dozen guys who are first class. I mean, they can just go hand the moon for you, right? You got 15 or so. They're going to be fine. They're solid guys and all that. And you got another half a dozen or so that are, you really got to be careful where you send them because they're, not very good at that. And it doesn't look like you're going to get better. So I was always in on the short list of if we were going to throw a war, we'd invite you first. And because some people, I think, the gene pool somehow gave them an overdose of, getting in a fight and getting in combat. And so I was surprisingly comfortable in combat and very, very cool. And I didn't get excited. And
Did you guys have a phrase for those people who you wanted by your side and fight?
well, the shrinks have a friend.
When the strings go on?
You have to be careful talking about that because otherwise people think you're a cool of some sort. But the fact of the matter is, you just happen to have a knack that you do that well. It's sort of like a gift. So there's guys playing baseball that have a gift that I never had, and you don't know why they got it, and they don't know why they got it. But you know that if you practice for the rest of your life, you'll never be as good as them. And that was kind of the position I was in. And so I adapt to that environment better than most, and I'm very comfortable in it.
Did it serve you well when you got out of the military?
No, getting out was really hard. But on my last assignment, I was fortunate. I had a really good assignment. I was working off and on for DIA, and I was on some compartmentalized missions and things like that. So I had a little something going on.
They kind of eased you out of it.
Yeah. So I got out, and once again, I worked hard, with my day job of getting back into being a normal human being. And now I'm in a civilian environment where there's no other military guys around, or at least none that I knew. The nighttime transition, I think, took 5 to 8 years.
So that did go away.
Yeah, it did. Right up until the time I started to write the book. So what happened is that, you go through a lot of work to try to forget. And then you say, well, geez, I got some great stories here. And so the more you tell the stories and the more you write the book, you have to then remember all the things you worked so hard to forget. But it's not as hard years later.
All right. So we got off. I want to go back to actually, I guess Philippines. We're going to jump around a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about your ejection experience.
Yeah.
That was, reading about it was intense. And I still don't think I fully grasp what 27 Gs could feel like and the circumstances in which you landed. So just to tee it up a little bit, you had to eject in the Philippines. Talk about the 27 Gs. Talk about basically, I think it was 800 feet straight down, ejecting downwards.
Yeah.
I don't want to give the story away, but pick it up from there and let's walk through that story. But that is pretty incredible.
All right. So the deal we had going on there is my squadron was split up into 3 ways. So the main part of the squadron was in the Philippine Islands, and they supported our detachment, which was about half of the squadron or more, in Da Nang for the strikes up in the North Vietnam.
So based in Philippines, but operating in Vietnam.
Right. And we also had a small detachment set a nuke alert on Chinese targets out of Taiwan. It's sort of a, oh, by the way, from the Chinese perspective, in case they wanted to become too involved or too aggressive in what was going on in Vietnam, North Vietnam at the time. I guess the American, not military, but probably the president decided that having half a dozen nukes would sort of keep him cool and dissuade him from getting too aggressive. So anyway, but the Philippine Islands was a neutral country. And so we couldn't launch strikes into Vietnam out of the Philippine Islands. So what we could do is we could launch a couple of airplanes in the morning, fly over to Da Nang, which was about a 2-hour ride and land there, turn the birds, arm them up, and then go north. But at the time, the Philippine government had a huge Huck problem. Huck being a guerrilla operation, communist guerrilla operation. It was sort of centered in Mindanao, but Luzon was a hotspot as well. And so apparently, I say apparently because this is what the investigative guys found out later on. So a Huck team came in at night and set up at least one ZSU on the end of the runway, ZSU being, the Russian 50 cal, quad 50 or whatever, at the end of our runway. And so I was on the first ride out in the morning to take a bird over to Da Nang to, turn. Typical takeoff roll, afterburner engaged. I'm reaching for the gear and the flaps, and I'm about 30, 40, 50 feet in the air. Right as I cross the end of the runway, I get peppered by the ZSU, and aircraft exploded. So the design of the particular aircraft, the F-100, was that right behind the pilot's seat is a huge fuel tank that feeds the engine, the main engine. So that's the main fuel tank. So when they did that and hit the airplane, I was told that now hot pieces of metal get thrown into the fuel tank, which then the fumes explode. So you're in a cockpit about the size of your chair, and you're enveloped in a canopy and all that, and the explosion just fills the cockpit with fire. So you're kind of sitting in the fire and wondering, what the hell happened? And so I pulled up to the right to try to get some altitude and sort things out. And as I climbed up to the right, I got the second explosion. Same thing, more fire into the cockpit. So it's really uncomfortable because you're sitting there and you're burning, and all the skin that's exposed is melting.
What is your mindset in this moment in time? Is it just panic? Is it you just fall back on training? Are you kind of like a passive observer watching yourself in the situation?
It is a little bit passive, but all of your actions have been rehearsed so often, right? That you're kind of going through the motion mechanically while all this is going on. Obviously, the first decision I had is I needed to scratch for some altitude and get myself, Second decision I had was when I got up to about 1,000, 1,200 feet, something like that, I looked down and it turns out I was over the city of Angeles, which, and if I punched out, which would have been a logical thing to do, then the aircraft a burning aircraft with munitions would have dropped into the center of the city in the housing area, and obviously you'd be killing a lot of innocent people. So I decided to had an opportunity to get it away from the city and over an area with elephant grass, just again, before you got to the jungle. And if I could get it over there, then I could punch out over there. So as I was getting over, just as I was getting over to the elephant grass, I got the third explosion. And when that happened, the flight control system burned through. And so I had no control over the airplane. And when it burned through, I rolled over and nose down inverted. And so the ejection seat, if you think about an airplane, the ejection seat is designed to eject you up that way. Well, if you turn that and roll it inverted and nose down, then instead of being fired up, you're being fired down.
Mm-hmm.
So when you fire the ejection seat in that particular airplane, again, one of the early jet fighters, you instantly get 27 Gs. And when you get that, anything that's not in exactly the right place breaks. But if you're in a situation where you're being thrown around the cockpit and you're on fire and everything's melting and you're burning, all you're trying to do is get out with whatever's left. I'll give it a shot. So what happened is that I get fired out, and you have a butt kicker that kicks you out of the seat. That worked fine. And now I'm looking up, and the pilot sheet came out and deployed fine. I'm looking down, and here comes the ground. And I'm thinking, and that was when I was thinking to myself, we really need to hurry up with this parachute thing, because otherwise
800 feet's not a lot of time for a parachute.
No. So the accident board said that I got out at 800 feet, but I was going down. Well, I didn't have a parachute, so it's not like I could steer the chute.
Yeah.
So, and as you're watching the ground coming up at you, it seems to be coming up a lot faster than the parachute's working. So anyway, about the time I thought that I was in a lot of trouble, I hit into this jungle stream and went into the mud up to my chin, literally. And so now I'm in a stream, and I'm kind of punchy because, this is all taking place in probably a minute and a half. And so about that time, I feel things bumping into my head, and and I looked and there was a couple of large black snakes in the thing. Well, I didn't necessarily know if they were poisonous or not, but I knew that they were there first and that I should leave. And so I climbed up the side of the stream. And about that time, coming through the grass is, I don't know, half a dozen guys or something like that. And it looked like they had AKs. So the typical deal is what they do is they throw a cordon around you in a circle and then they begin to squeeze the circle. And then, but having the experience of watching what happened to American advisors in my first tour, I was smart enough to realize that I didn't think that was a very fun thing to do. So I shot a couple of the guys, and like all good infantry guys, when somebody's shooting at you, you get down. And about that time, an Army chopper got in close to the tree line, so I was able to get through the bad guys, hustle on over to the Army chopper and get a ride back to the base. The problem was that I'd broken my back in 3 places. And that trip over to the chopper really screwed things up because it screwed the, all of the back and the spinal cord and stuff like that. I was lucky, and obviously I got cut up and stuff like that. But the funny part of the story was, the chopper guys get me in the chopper, and we're landing at the hospital, and so they get me onto a stretcher and they're rolling me into the hospital. So now I'm all muddy and bloody and dirty, and whatever. So as we come through the door to the hospital, there's a lady there with her son, and as I'm going by, the lady looks at me and she fainted, and I thought, she's like, I gotta do something about my appearance. I mean, this whole thing.
Oh my God.
So anyway, I got to the hospital, and then the first guy that comes in that I got to see shortly thereafter was a flight surgeon. The flight surgeon says to me, can I get anything for you? And I said, well, yeah. I said, when I went into the water, I said, my cigarettes got all wet and stuff like that. I said, so how about a pack of cigarettes and a lighter? He said, no, I can't. We don't allow smoking in the hospital. I said, well, how about some mission whiskey? He said, well, you can't have mission whiskey because we have more tests to take on you. And I thought, why the hell did you ask me if you weren't going to help, why would you bother? But anyway, so that whole episode was really over in a relatively short period of time, but it was just a sort of fast-paced thing until you get to the chopper, and then everything slows down.
Everything that seems like it could have went wrong, but you still lived. But then the irony is that they made you fly again.
Oh yeah. So
to make sure there was no negative mental programming.
Right.
But roll with that okay. With a broken back.
All right. So the deal back then was if you have a bad incident in an airplane where you eject or something like that, or you have a crash or whatever, it's maybe not 100%, but a lot of people get fear of flying, and they're not going to get back in the seat. And you can see that because one trip around this block is enough for anybody. I'm on the air, I think I'll go sell shoes or whatever. So the deal was that in order to avoid that, we got to get you back in the saddle right away. My operations officer, who was the boss, the guy in charge of flying for the squadron, he comes into the hospital room to see how I'm doing, and so he says, okay, Graham, we got to get you back in a jet right away. He says, I've already worked on tomorrow's schedule, and you're on first thing tomorrow morning. He said, and then if we don't do that, you could become afraid of flying. And I said, boss, you're too late. I'm already afraid of flying. I said, how about a 6-pack of scotch and a trip to Manila? And I'll see you in a week. He said, no, I got to get you back in. So anyway, after we bantered that thing back and forth a lot, he won. And so he got me some new clothes and stuff like that, and sent out a couple of big muscular crew chiefs the next day to carry me up the ladder and strap me in the bird.
Did they know your back was broken?
No, we didn't know that because apparently the hospital didn't catch it. And that became a problem later on. So they didn't realize that they broken me back in 3 places. And they said, well, you should be fine. Cuts and stuff like that. They'll heal. It should be fine. Anyway, and we were flying into the north, right on, bombing missions and stuff like that. And so they put me back in the lineup. And the problem was that pulling G's and stuff like that in combat is really painful. And so, but I was able to finish out the tour, which took another couple of months. And then by the time I got back to the States, I was beginning to have periods of paralysis from the waist down. That's when the docs finally sent me over to the hospital in San Antonio to see what they could do to fix me up. And there was nothing they could do to fix me up by that time. So that's when I went through that big, long rehab period, learn how to walk again and stuff like that.
So you had to learn how to walk again.
It's a great story. So about this this woman. So I went to the hospital, and first you go to the orthopedic surgeons, they couldn't do anything. Then you go to neuro guys, and they can't do anything. And so you're in a wheelchair and you're paralyzed from the waist down, and nobody can help, right? And it looked very much like you're going to be there for the rest of your life, which is not much to look forward to. So after a few days of being tested, this one doc said to me, he said, there's a nurse that is working on a brand new experimental program. You might be a good candidate for her. And she's got this idea that says that she can take people that have lost large portions of the network of nerves that trigger the muscles, that she can teach you how to walk using different muscles. And they said, what do you think about that? And I said, well, there's no downside, right? I'm here. I'm not walking at all now. So anyway, they hooked me up with her, and she had two other people that she was experimenting with, but she liked me the best because I brought to her a combat injury that was really, more complicated than what the other guys had, which were mostly upper body stuff. So we started out, it was like a little bitty office with 3 straight back chairs, a treadmill, and that was it. And so the first thing you got to do is figure out how to get out of the wheelchair. And eventually you work on getting out of the wheelchair. And then the next thing you know, you get on the treadmill. And then the next thing you know, you're walking. You may not be walking very good, but you're walking. And you keep on walking until you can walk better. And then the next thing you got to do is you got to learn how to run. And you can't do that very well. But then the more you do, the better you get at that. And then in the meantime, you got to be able to pass all of the physical requirements to get back on flight status. My upper body was in pretty good shape, right? Because I set up my hospital bed with a chinny bar.
Nice.
And, when you run around in a wheelchair, you're doing a lot of pumping. So all I really need to worry about was, some of the core things and the legs. So anyway, after she's on, I'd say 5 months or something like that, gradually getting better and better and getting better. She arranged and I arranged to go down and meet a flying evaluation board of doctors. And I made the case that says I was good enough to get back on flying status and was good enough to move around the airplane and that we were running short on pilots over in Vietnam. And so they really needed to get me back on flight status so I could go over there. I gave them one of the most patriotic speeches you have ever heard in your life about why they should get me back on flying status and send me back over to Vietnam. But anyway, so I won the case, and then I jumped on the airplane, flew home.
Did they ever question your ability to do another ejection with your back and the condition it was?
No, that question never came up.
But you knew you could not do another ejection.
Yeah, because my back was so screwed up at the time, and I was still trying to work my way through the pain level. Right. And I knew that if I punched out, see, the idea behind punching out is your spinal cord is straight. Everything's straight. Everything is in the perfect position. Well, mine was already skewed in a couple of different places. So my assumption is that if I punch out, I either break it in new places or I break it in old places. And now I'm on the ground in a place where people don't like you. And that didn't seem like very much fun. So I decided not to eject anymore.
That part of your story was remarkable to me. I think out of you did around 500 combat flights,
Right.
And out of I'd say about 50 of them you think you got shot up in,
Yeah.
which means you knew you were not going to eject. So you were either going to land the plane or you're going to die.
Right.
And you completely accepted that, and you
Yeah.
kept going back.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's unusual. Were most pilots this aggressive, or was this just your passion for getting into the fight?
I think a lot of it may have been my passion to get back in the fight. I mean, because come on, God punch you around. You got to get back in there.
Right.
Right. Got to get back up.
Right.
And I sort of felt like they owed me a couple. So, so I got back in the fight, and it worked out just fine. And by the way, they did pay back.
You had to go AWOL at one point to get back to Vietnam to fight.
Yeah.
How did that work out?
So I got out of the hospital just before Christmas and went home, talked to my wife, and said, got to get back in the game,
And she supported you.
Yeah, she was really great. By the way, I will say, in her defense, I thought when I volunteered for my fourth tour, she was a little antsy about that. I don't think she was really fond of that one. But the third tour, I think by that time she had probably written me off as, some psycho that but anyway, but she was terrific about it. And I had to manage. When they discharge you from the hospital, they don't give you any orders. They just send you home. So for all intents and purposes, nobody on the base except my wife and family knew I was there. But the group that was still there at the base was scheduled to go to Aviano, Italy for deployment. And my squadron had been redeployed back over to Vietnam to fly the first missions into North Vietnam. So if I had stayed there, they'd have put me in a group going to Italy. So I decided that the best thing to do is not say anything to anybody. So I got an airline ticket. I flew up to San Francisco. And I got a cab over to the air base that was handling all of our Asian deployments. And it was Christmas Eve. And so I went over to the officers club, and there was me and a bartender. And the bartender's bummed out, and and I'm bummed out. So we're having a couple of drinks, and in walks this guy. So now we got 3 guys in the whole officers club. And the guy's really upset because he just got divorced. And so he's sitting next to each other, and the conversation goes like, so what are you doing here? What are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm here because I need to get a ride to Saigon. And he said, well, why don't you just take your orders and get on the regular, I said, well, I don't have any orders. And he said, what do you mean you don't have any orders? I said, well, I don't have any orders. I'm hitchhiking a ride. And he said, well, you're AWOL. And he said, you can't do that. And so we're having this conversation back and forth, and we're drinking and we're carrying on. And he says, I happen to be the aircraft commander, and I'm flying over to Saigon tomorrow. He said, I'll tell you what. He said, if you'll be down on a ramp at, it was like, I don't know, 6:30 or 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, we're leaving for Saigon. I'll smuggle you aboard the airplane, and you'll be flying in the pilot's area, and I'll put you on the manifest, and then but you can't get off the airplane, because if you get off the airplane, now you're going to be dealing with customs and military policemen and all that, and you're going to go to jail. I said, okay. So I showed up the next morning. I'm on the ramp with my gear, and here he comes, and he put me on the airplane. We flew to first Hawaii, and then I think next stop was Guam, and then we hit the Philippine Islands and Manila, and finally we ended up in Saigon. So now I can get off the airplane. So the guy says, okay, well, wait right here at the airplane. We're going to get a pickup truck. So he grabbed a pickup truck, picked me up, took me out to the main gate, and by that, while I was in the airplane, I put on civilian clothes. So he takes me out to the main gate, and I hired a Vietnamese taxi driver to drive me to the airbase that my squadron was at, and it was like an hour drive or something like that. And went up, and then I got at the gate at the base, and when I walked into the air police, I said, I'm here to rejoin my squadron, and I know you guys couldn't win the war without me anyway. So I did. So so there was a lot of So the colonels did not quite understand why I did that. And so there was a lot of standing attention saying, yes or no, sir, and I'll never do it again, sir. And then after a couple hours of that, they decided that since I was already there, they might as well put me to work. So they sent me down to my fighter squadron. I checked in, got my gear, sorted out, jumped in the jet.
They had to have admired that.
I think they probably did. I think particularly the colonel boss that I had, I think he thought I was a little bit goofy, but
That's what they needed in Vietnam.
yeah, right,
That's what you need in combat.
yeah, and he became kind of a mentor for me and sort of a father figure afterwards. So we had a good relationship, but so it all worked out fine.
So you're flying. You're not going to be able to eject.
Right.
Can you talk about your Silver Star mission?
It was a monsoon season, which is at around May. Now, at the airbase, we always had two birds on board at the end of the runway. And the idea being, because lots of times you get a pop-up target, like 18 base under attack or something like that. Things, for the kind of things that were unexpected, that you can schedule ahead of time. And we kept two birds and two pilots on alert in a little tiny trailer type thing. And on this particular day during this period of time, the weather was lousy. So by lousy, I mean probably the ceilings were 400 or 500 feet. And this was maybe a mile and a half, something like that. Typical monsoon thing where the entire country is covered in cloud. And for some bizarre reason, the Air Force headquarters in Saigon grounded the entire country. And so nobody was flying. Everybody's on the ground. So my buddy and I are in a alert hangar, and we're thinking, hey, cool it. We'll, write letters home or hang out, grab some sleep, do whatever. And we're there a couple of hours, and we get a phone call from the headquarters in Saigon that said, hey, the main North Vietnamese force was stationed in Cambodia directly across the border from the area by Thanh Nam province in Vietnam. We used to call it the Paris Peak. And so he said that the North Vietnamese army had moved across the border in size being thousands, like, 8,000, 10,000 North Vietnamese soldiers coming across into South Vietnam. And that they had a fire base under attack. The fire base had a couple of hundred Americans here. And the fire base was about to get overrun. And if that's true, then a couple of hundred Americans were massacred. And so they said there's nobody else in the country, literally, that can fly. Would you two guys be willing to take off and help out? And so we said, well, sure. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to let hundreds of Americans die? And you say, well, it's raining out. I can't fly. Come on. So anyway, so we said that we'd give it a shot. Apparently, the guy who asked us that question was not high enough rank that he didn't realize that he was asking us if we wouldn't mind breaking the rules that the four stars had put in place. And but it didn't matter.
But so the mission wasn't approved from the highest levels?
Right.
He didn't know that. Or did he know that and he did it anyway?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'd like to think that he did it anyway, but
yeah.
I never can tell. So it seemed like a reasonable thing for us to do. So we jumped in, took off, flew over, got over the target. And sure enough, it was a really hot target. Lots of stuff going on. And the forward air controller talked us down underneath the cloud. But to put that in perspective, so if you have a ceiling of, let's say, 500 feet, and the trees grow to 200 to 250 feet, you're flying in that 200-foot envelope, right? So everything's a flat attack. So anyway, he talked us down. My buddy puts in the first attack, and I'm right behind him. And he goes in, and he dropped a couple of bombs. As I'm going in, I had hit really hard and got absolutely hammered by a couple of ZSUs, I guess. And so while Jack was putting in the strike and the fire base, once you're hit, I climbed up above the cloud and I was trying to figure out if I'd keep the airplane flying or not. And by finagling it with it a little bit, I could keep it flying just above stall speed. So that would have been, let's say, 200, 250 knots, something like that. Stall speed was about probably 195-ish or something like that. So you have a small window that you can work in. But the problem was both of my fuel boost pumps had been shot away. And so the only way I could get fuel to the engine was through gravity, which meant that I couldn't go any faster than a couple of hundred knots and that I couldn't make any abrupt maneuvers. So no ups and downs and no lefts and rights and no pulling G's or anything like that. Because if I did, it would interrupt the gravity flow into the engine, and then the engine flames out, and there you are. So I realized that I could, by flying very gently and very slow and carefully, I could keep the thing airborne. And so I was up there sort of hanging out, waiting for Jack to take me back to escort me back to the air base. And in the meantime, he finishes taking care of the bad guys in this particular fire base. And then he comes up and meets me, and I'm on his wing, and we're going to head back to Benoit. And about that time, we get a call from the FAC, and the FAC says, we got a huge problem here. And it turns out that there was another larger Army fire base a little ways away that was under attack, and that they estimated by 4,000 plus bad guys, and there's like 300 or 400 Americans on the base. Don't know how many. And he said, and the bad guys are in the wires coming through the concertina, and the fire base is, in great jeopardy being overrun. And artillery guys had lowered their tubes so that they're flying directly into the wire. So things are not good. And if they break through the wire in one spot, they're inside, and now you got hand-to-hand. And once the Americans and the North Vietnamese get into the mix, I can't help them because, I got to kill a lot of Americans in order to kill some North Vietnamese. So the problem we had was that Jack had a good airplane, but he's got no munitions left. I got a bad airplane, but I have all my munitions left. So it's kind of an awkward thing. So they said, the FAC calls me up. He says, so what do you think? If you want to give it a shot? And I went, yeah, I give it a shot, see how it goes. And so he talked me down. Then he said, listen, the artillery guys can't lift their fire. If they do, the guys are through the wire on them, and it's all over but the whistling and shouting. So I said, well, I'd be willing to put the strike in underneath the fire. And that hadn't ever been done before, because obviously there's not a lot of space underneath. So all the explosions coming up are going to take a lot of friendly fire. And so, but we agreed on all that. And so I still see it in my mind's eye when I broke through the clouds and I looked out and I saw the situation on the ground. It was like, and the only way I know how to describe it was like somebody went in and kicked over an anthill. You got literally thousands of enemy soldiers massed around this relatively small compound, and they're breaking through the wire in a large circumference. And once they get through, and they didn't have very far to go, then it's all over from that point on, and then all the Americans are massacred. So I went down, and I started and put my 2 bombs in, and then I just stayed down there in amongst them. And when I say that, I mean, it's very, very close. So it was like almost being part of it, right? Because I'm only, I'm flying around at 100 feet above them. And so you can see wherever they mass, you can, and obviously the guns are all firing, and the guns, they use those ESUs, and they're all loaded with tracer. So the Vietnamese loaded like 1 out of every 6 rounds was a tracer round, which is great because that way you knew exactly where they were. All you got to do is run back the yellow stream. So I put in two 500-pounders, and then I followed up with, I had CBU cluster bomb units, and probably, it wasn't like I made individual passes because I was just down, so I take out a group of them or guns, and then I kind of rudder the airplane around slowly and find another bunch, and then I do the same thing. And I think I did like probably, let's say, roughly 15 passes.
So you're low on gas.
Right.
You're beneath cloud cover.
Yeah.
You're the only plane in the sky. So every bad guy knows you're there and is probably trying to take aim at you.
Yeah.
Boots on the ground are about to be overrun. You have a broken back and can't eject. So this is like the most epic situation possible.
Yeah, but even if I want to eject, if I eject,
You're gonna land in
I
the
land in
middle.
the middle of the bad guys, right? So
From your position up there, worst case scenario, boots on the ground, but up there as a fighter pilot, you being you, was that sort of target rich environment a dream come true? Like, what was your mindset like there?
Well, first of all, that's really funny. Just before you commit, you realize you're going to die, right? That's a dead deal.
Yeah.
Right? Even if, as I used to say, even if you're a lousy shot, if you have a big airplane and he's like right next door to you, you have trouble missing, right? So you know you're going to take a lot of hits. You know you're not going to eject. You know that the airplane is going to get shot down, and you go, well, okay, yeah. So from that point on, you know you don't have to worry about it.
What's left?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So now all you have to do is focus on the work at hand. And so you just stay down there and shooting and killing and do that for as long. And then once I was out of CBU and once I was out of my two 500-pounders, I still had my guns left. So that particular airplane had 420-millimeter cannon, 800 rounds. So I went around and selectively killed all of the gun positions. And because the bad guys were kind of huddled around the gun positions.
So you traced the tracers back to where the gun positions were.
Yeah. So what happens is the guy in the gun position would be firing at me, and then all I got to do is go through that. You just go through the tracers, and you finally get to where you're close enough to where you can open fire and accurately kill them. But you have to go follow the guys through a tracer thing to get there. And so I did 4 or 5 of those passes and managed to kill all the guns. And the guns were really chopping me up. So the canopy was shot away. The instrument panel was mostly shot away. I mentioned in the book that I looked out to take a look at my left wing because don't forget it's raining inside now, right? They shot my whole every way. So I looked out at my left wing and I couldn't believe all the holes going up through the wing. And then I looked at my CPU pod and it was on fire burning. And I thought, Jesus, this is really discouraging. So I stopped looking out. So, because if I can't do anything about it, why worry about it? So then I ran out of ammo. And then by sometime during that period of time, the thousands of enemy troops broke and they started panicking and running back towards the border in Cambodia. And I thought, well, those guys won't know I'm out of ammo. So I made a couple of 3 or 4 passes over the top of them about 50 feet or something like that, and just to think, well, keep it going, guys. And so if you're that close to people with a jet and a big airplane, it scares a lot of people.
And to show a force.
Yeah. And so anyway, so it turned out to be a good thing. So the Army guys gave me credit for a minimum of 1,500 enemy troops killed and 8 gun positions destroyed. And the Army guys lived happily ever after.
It's a good story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a great day.
The Army was stingy in giving you a Silver Star for that.
Well, so obviously, I'm under house arrest and I'm going to be court-martialed and all that kind of stuff. But the rule was that the highest award that a service can give to a member of another service is the Silver Star.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So what happens is, in the Air Force, so you have the Silver Star, Air Force Cross, and Medal of Honor, right? And the same in the Army. But the Army can't recommend an Air Force course, and they can't recommend an Air Force middle law. But you got to remember that I broke all those regulations. Like there was 5 regulations that I disobeyed in one flight, which I think is maybe an Air Force record.
It's good.
Close. And so the highest award that the Army could give me was the Silver Star. But the Air Force had to punish me because you can't have people disobeying direct orders, or you end up with a bunch of,
Cowboys.
Unruly guys, right? And the unruly guys may be good in war, but they're not very good from a military standpoint. So if you're going to maintain control of all of your troops in an orderly fashion and stuff like that, well, you have to be able to punish guys who break rules. So the Army recommended through Air Force channels that I got the Silver Star. The Air Force accepted that. They dropped the court-martial charges. And so they were able to punish me, but at the same time get an Army Silver Star. And I was really happy because getting out of jail was a good idea.
Yeah. God, that's an incredible story. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. We'll kind of wrap up the combat piece. You talk a little bit in the book about more political concerns and leadership. And you told a story about there was a shortage of bombs.
Right.
And you had a friend who was tasked with destroying a concrete port. And since he ran out of, I guess, GPUs, he had to use napalm and 20 millimeter, which doesn't destroy a concrete.
And that's all we had. Yeah.
He ended up becoming a POW at the Hanoi Hilton for years.
Right.
And that's just the result of sheer incompetence, forcing the mission anyway. And you basically said the president and SecDef, the Secretary of Defense, were making tactical decisions on the ground.
Yes.
Just from the high level.
Yeah.
How did that leadership impact you in the war and then even later in life?
Well, during the war, the biggest issue was that you got a president who was, by this time, Johnson was the president. So you got a school teacher out of Texas. You got a politician out of Boston, I think Boston, the sick state. And you got an accountant out of Ford Motor Company, the Secretary of Defense.
McNamara.
Yeah. So on an earlier press thing, he got questioned about the bomb shortage in Vietnam. And the reason he got questioned on this is because we're having a bomb shortage in Vietnam. And he answered that by saying we do not have a bomb shortage. And he was right. All the bombs were in Europe. The problem was he didn't have the war in the right place, right? So from a logistical standpoint, the way you're supposed to work that is you're supposed to have the bombs and a war in the same location.
You would think, yeah.
The other thing that they were doing, we found out later, was that in order to try to minimize civilian casualties in North Vietnam, the president and Secretary of State and SecDef would provide all of the flight information and strike information to the North Vietnamese through the Swiss embassy. And so every time we went in on a strike, we got chopped up because they knew where we were coming, what we're coming with, what our route in was, what our exit route was, what altitudes we'd be at, what airspeeds we'd be at, and everything else.
Unreal.
So when we showed up, the air defense posture in North Vietnam was, according to the intel guys, heavier than it was in Berlin during World War II. And so what was happening was our losses were unreasonably high. And also, your effectiveness gets decayed because when you're under intense fire, it's harder to remain focused and track the target and stuff like that. But the big thing was that we probably could have reduced our losses by at least a third.
It's incredible.
And so what happens is that now you go, well, you guys were supposed to have my back, right? I mean, it's not like I started the war. You guys started the war. Then you decide you're going to go, that your main strategy is interdiction in North Vietnam. And then because you have some goofball idea that when you tell the North Vietnamese, it's not like they'll move their people out of the way. It's that they'll move the defensive in the way. And that we're supposed to be smarter than that. And so what happens is that you begin to understand that the American people don't like it. They're all back home protesting and Berkeley. Your bosses, the president and SecDef and those guys, they obviously don't like you because they don't care whether you live or die. In fact, McNamara once said when he was questioned about it, he said, we got plenty of fighter pilots. And we thought, well, that's not a very nice thing to say. So anyway, so the one thing you learn in Vietnam is nobody's got your back. And if you're there fighting for each other. You're not fighting for, mom and apple pie and all that kind of stuff. You're fighting for each other. And so when people say, well, why would you keep going back? And say, well, I didn't go back for the Secretary of Defense. I went back for my buddy. Yeah. Because while you're sitting on a bench in Phoenix, Arizona, your friends are dying. And so I don't know what the president and all the politicians are thinking about, but I know what I'm thinking about. I need to get in there and help my buddy. So whenever you think about the Vietnam War, all of us had a couple of, let's say two choices. We could either be disgusted by the way the war was being conducted and try to get out of it and avoid it and leave it, or you can say, well, I don't like those guys and I don't like their way they're fighting the war, but they don't call me up and ask me. But I do know that I have close friends dying. And by God, I'm not going to sit here while that's happening. Let me get over there and help out. And so the motivation is a little different than we've had in the past 20, 25 years where you had the American people behind it. So
a lot of that was lessons learned from how horrific it was in Vietnam, the way they treated American soldiers then. I think they more than made up for it now.
Yeah, they did. But I was far more comfortable fighting in Asia than I was living in the United States. When I was in California, they, keyed my car and vandalized my car. When the American people decide they hate something, they usually don't blame it on the politicians, right? But one of the things about their military was that the guys were all walking around with uniforms on. So you get to see them at the airport. You get to see them at the train station. You get to see them when they're home with their families and taking the kids to school. So what you learned is that the business about, you're not fighting for the American people. They don't want you. You're not fighting for the American politician. They don't want you. So who are you fighting for? Well, it leaves you and your buddies hanging out over there. Mm. And you fight probably harder for them than you do for anybody else. But that's what gets you going back, right? It's, hey, okay, I got it. It's just our small team, a relatively small team, but it's our team. And I'm not going to sit by while, those guys are in trouble.
There seems to be a parallel between what happened when we left Vietnam and abandoning those allies who we did care about, like the Montagnards, for example, and what we did a few years ago in Afghanistan. Did you see, in your mind, was that a very similar process with the same sorts of mistakes from senior leadership?
Almost identical. And so this is really interesting. By the way, the French did exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. When the French were being thrown out of Vietnam, two things that really struck me. When the French wounded were placed on ships and taken back to Marseille, for treatment in French hospitals, as they were unloading the wounded on the French dock, they were stoned by French citizens. And when the French pulled out of Vietnam, they had special forces teams spotted around the countryside. And they literally cut the wire in communication and left them there.
They left their own French special forces soldiers in the wild.
Yeah. And so there was a quiet form of maybe not genocide, but there's a horrendous amount of punishment kinds of, murders and all that kind of stuff. So when I went into Da Nang for the first time, the French pulled out of Da Nang. It used to be a French air base. They tore down all of the buildings. They pulled up all of the wiring, underground wire, pulled up all of the plumbing, and they took all of the Vietnamese workers that had worked on the base in terms of maintenance and things like that, and they killed them.
The French did?
Yeah. So when we got there, or when I got there, let's say 4 or 5 years after the French pulled out, the only thing that we had that wasn't jungle were concrete pads that had been left there. Everything else and everybody else had been eliminated from the process, so you couldn't reuse that facility.
Why would the French kill them, the people who supported them, and abandon their own special forces?
Because they were abandoning them to the North Vietnamese.
Abandoning their own soldiers to the North Vietnamese.
Yeah.
Why?
Because they didn't want to go to the bother. We did the same thing. When we decided to shut down the war in Vietnam, we literally just abandoned the mountain yards.
Well, we didn't abandon Americans. I'm wondering why the French abandoned Americans. I'm sorry, the French abandoned French.
I was told that there were some covert option teams in the north that we had left there.
That I could believe. In the North, yes.
Yeah.
Given
Yeah.
how little the politicians care.
Yeah.
That's just shocking about the French.
But then you had the evacuation of Saigon, right? And the evacuation of Saigon was almost a replica for the evacuation in Afghanistan. And one of the reasons for that, by the way, is that most evacuations come under the auspices of the State Department, not the Defense Department. So if you think about, like if you're stationed in Korea with a family or something like that, and they decide that things aren't going well, and they decide to evacuate, that falls under the purview of the State Department. So at best in Afghanistan, they would have had to coordinate defense and state, and they would have had to figure out who's going to give the orders about whether you should get out of Bagram or you should go out of some other airport or whatever. And all those things get very confusing and very political.
So if you could look back at your military career, what would be one or two of the most memorable, the best aspects you can think of?
Well, so I enlisted in the Air Force when I was 18. So I was raised in the Air Force, right? So there's a ton of stuff I really liked about it. Most of all, I like the people. The difference between working in civilian industry and working in the military is like night and day. When you're in a fighter squadron, you got 25 guys that are joined at the hip. I mean, they're not friends, they're family, right? And you never have to worry about if you're in trouble, whether they're going to come to your rescue, because they will. In the military, guys will actually sacrifice their lives to save the life of one of their buddies, right? And that's unheard of in civilian life. The other thing that's unheard of in civilian life is having a strong ethical compass. And the reason is because like in the military, people join the military to make a lot of money. They join it for a lot of other things that are important to them, but it ain't the money. In American industry, you price people and their work and their positions involved. So as a result, they talk about forming teams. They don't form teams. You can't form teams when you're pricing people in dollars and cents, right? You form teams when you have a greater cause that you join together to accomplish. So the thing that struck me the most when I left the military is the idea that the guy sitting next to me would happily steal from me because he would get more money and I'd get less money. But the guy in my fighter squadron would never even dream of that. That would never even occur to him, right? He died for me. So the difference in the culture is enormous. And so, we're lucky here because, what we've done here is we built a team. And that's largely because that's my military heritage. I can't reward people. I can't go up to somebody and say, boy, you're the best master sergeant I've ever seen. I'm going to give you an extra $50. No, I can't do that. And so what we try to do here is we have I think, a unique business here. All of us here really like coming to work. We really like who we're working with. We motivate people largely through appreciation. Where Michelle will do something for me, and I'll thank her very much, and Maria will do something, and when we're together and we're talking about a knotty problem and which way the markets are going or not going or whatever, we got friends sitting there discussing, saying, well, what about this? What about that? It's very, very open. Everybody hangs together. Everybody likes each other. We care about their families. When I had my first large group that I commanded was about 1,200 people. When we get an inspection from higher headquarters, I'd be taken aside as the commander, and I was grilled on every one of the people who worked for me and what their lives were, what their health was. Did I know that they were in the hospital? How about their children? How are they doing in school? Things like that. And the grilling lasted, I think, 3-4 hours.
Wow.
And I was supposed to know all that stuff. And the reason is because, if you have somebody working with you and their kids having problems and they're in a hospital, well, their focus of attention needs to be on that child. That's not what you think about when you're in civilian life. And as a result of that, it's not that they don't have teams, that the teams are different. And in the military, because the team is your family. When you're with them, you're with your family, right? So, and the other thing about that, when you're in a family, that builds you that ethical compass that I talk about. You never have to worry about what those guys are committed to. It's right out there in front of you. But in civilian industry, people are trained to measure everything in terms of dollars. The people measure themselves, their self-worth, in terms of dollars. That's a shame, because it implies that you're for sale. All you gotta do is come up with the right price. And the idea that people are for sale is really objectionable to me.
It's like Huddle Hannah putting a bounty on you. How much is it worth?
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to wrap that part up. I usually finish with a quick series of questions.
Sure. Yeah.
So, what are one, two, three things you do to prime yourself for the workday? You're 90 years old. You're still getting after it. So, what do you do in the morning to get ready?
Sure. I go to work every day because it's not like I have tons of hobbies. I mean, what do I do, right? So, and I'm not going to sit around all day long watching daytime TV. So, I really enjoy coming to work. But I don't really have to prime myself in the morning because I'm anxious to come to work. And I'm anxious to, as I said earlier, I'm anxious to, be with all my friends. So my day starts very happy. I have a rule that says that when I walk in the door, that my job is to make everybody else in the room happy, right? And the reason is if I start out and I'm grumpy and I walk up and I bark at people, they're going to be grumpy all day long.
Yeah.
And if I do it a lot, then they're going to stop talking to me. And if they stop talking to me, nobody's going to tell me when the building's on fire. And so if I'm the boss, I'm going to get fired just because I'm grumpy and nobody wants to talk to me. And we've all been through the business about if you work for a guy that's grouchy or has a chip on his shoulder or something like that, nobody wants to be the messenger going into the guy's office because he's going to bark at you all the time. And so people stop going into the office. And as a result, the guy finds himself more and more isolated in the office and nobody wants to talk to him. And he doesn't know what's going on in his own business. And he fails. So I have a rule that says every single day, no matter what, no matter how I feel, it doesn't matter how I feel. What matters is how the people that work with me feel. And it's my job to pull them up and be happy and, put on a happy face. And so I do that.
I love it. Physical training program. So, like I said, you're 90.
Yeah.
For those who want to be able to still be robust when they're 90, right, what do you do to maintain?
I don't know how many hours. I spend a ton of time working out.
It's good.
I do. So a typical workout, now I'm lucky. I got the best personal trainer in the world. So, and I assign Mike is in charge of my body. And if things aren't working right, that's his fault. And he's got to keep my strength up. And then when I'm alone, my typical routine is like if tomorrow's an off day, my typical routine is 15 minutes on the bike, 5 minutes on the rowing machine, 15 on the bike, 5 on the rowing machine, nice. 15 on the bike, 5 on the rowing machine. So I get 45 minutes to an hour. And then I try to do that 3 days a week. If I'm really lucky and I can learn how to do it, I go play golf on the weekends and stuff like that. So I think that every single day of your life, you should be working. So I'll give you an example. The best instructions I ever got, the woman that got me walking and running again. When I left her and for the last time, she said, okay, she said, you got a lot of problems and stuff like that. Do 2 things. She said, don't get fat and work out every day. I went, okay, I can do that. When I got ready to retire from the Air Force, the guy said, don't get fat, work out every day, and have at least 2 drinks every night. I said, all right, I can do that. So I do that.
That's right. That's awesome. Books. What are 1, 2, 3 books that have changed your life?
I don't read books to read books. I decided that the reason what I do is I want to find out about something. So I'll just use this as an example. So when I was younger, I really got interested in Formula One. I didn't know anything about it. So I went to the base library and I read every book they had on Formula One. And I got something out of every one of those books. And so when I was working in Asia, and still am really fired up on Asian culture and let's say Japanese culture. And I spoke a little Japanese, can't read kanji, but it doesn't matter. I really like haiku. If I want to learn more about Japan, I might read Musashi or somebody like that.
One of my
But
favorite books of all time.
yeah, right? Because that kind of a culture really turns me on. That level of honesty, dedication, and courage really turns me on.
A severe commitment.
And so what happens is that when I read a book, I'll read for, let's say, a half hour, an hour, or something like that. And then I stop and I think about what I just read. And I say, well, so what did I learn? I just spent an hour and I've been reading about this, that, or the other thing. And what did I learn from it? And so I take that, and that's what I take away. And what happens is that I may forget the title of the book, but I won't forget what I learned. And so I'm a compulsive reader. But if you said, well, what are the 3 best books? So you say, well, okay, well, if I want to learn about the Army in World War I, maybe I read Once an Eagle by Meyer, or, something like that. But that's not really what I take away from a book. So for me, I try to always have 3 books that I'm reading. And I like to have 2 where I might get smarter if I'm lucky. And 1 is just pure entertainment. So like cowboy stories and, James Bond stories or whatever it happens to be. But I want to have 1 book I'm reading where I don't have to think about it because I know the good guys are going to win. I can identify the bad guys with the black hats and stuff like that. And the other 2, I'd like to be able to get a little bit smarter. So that's why I thought your question was so great, is because I can't tell you the names of the books, but I can tell you what I learned from hundreds of books. I did go through a period where I tried to read all the American classics, and also I got into things like philosophy and stuff like that, But that's because I wanted to understand the subject, but I can't tell you who wrote the book.
Probably one of the best answers I've got. I would say this was incredible. We probably touched on 3% of what was in your book. I kind of want to do a whole episode just on leadership because you already gave me some points to think about. Because we focused on the military as opposed to leadership. Absolutely, genuinely appreciate your time and your story and your service. How can people get your book if they want to buy it?
What's the easiest way for people to follow us and get a book?
Amazon. Go on to Amazon. You can get it that way. And then you also have a website, ColonelRobertJGraham.com.
ColonelRobertJGraham.com. All right. It's been a pleasure. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No. Yeah. I think it's really been fun.
Okay.
I think the next time we should serve drinks.
All right. Let's do it. All right, sir. Genuinely appreciate it.
I enjoyed it. Every minute of it. It was fun.
Thank you. That's it for this episode. If you want to check out more from the podcast, head to zeroeyes.com/Nobel, where you can see show notes, read more about our guests, and suggest guests or topics of your own. Until next time, stay in the fight. Don't ring the bell.